European leaders are expected to discuss Donald Trump's latest tariff threats as they gather today in Brussels for a meeting on defense.
There are growing fears of a major global trade war tonight after President Trump announced sweeping tariffs.
So the UK is way out of line, and we'll see the UK, but European Union is really out of line.
C'est simple, nous on pense que la priorité, elle est à cet agenda stratégique et de sécurité de nos frontières, et si nous étions attaqués sur des sujets commerciaux.
Donald Trump's recent tariff maneuvers against Canada, Mexico, and China have set in motion a new dynamic in global trade. The impact was immediate: 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican products, up to 60% on Chinese goods. But now Europe has entered the line of fire. As European leaders gather today in Brussels for a defense summit, another concern dominates the sidelines: the specter of a full-scale global trade war. Trump has already signaled that the European Union will be the next to face heavy tariffs. His words were blunt, almost defiant. "They've been taking advantage of us for too long." The European response, however, is far from unified. The United Kingdom, out of step with the bloc, has yet to define its stance. But what is known is that the American president promises concrete measures against the EU, and promises them soon. These statements triggered immediate alarm among European bloc members. Trump's fiscal warnings sparked an urgent debate about how Europe should react. It was in this tense context that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, broke. Emmanuel Macron's statements on trade tariffs surprised even the most seasoned observers, and possibly Donald Trump himself. During the European Union's informal defense summit in Brussels, the French president broke with the usual diplomatic language and delivered a direct message: Europe is ready to strike back. While other bloc leaders were still seeking the path of dialogue, Macron drew a clear line. In his words, if the United States ramps up tariff pressure, Europe must respond firmly, not just out of retaliation, but for strategic survival. According to him, Europe cannot afford to appear weak in an increasingly competitive global landscape. It must position itself as a power that demands respect. Macron proposed a coordinated response among member states, a unified economic front against any trade aggression from Washington. His message was clear: in times of tension, hesitation is weakness. And in this new game of strength, Europe needs to show it's not willing to back down. Facing the tariff threat from Washington, Emmanuel Macron proposed a response that goes beyond rhetoric, a structural transformation in Europe's economic stance. For the French president, the bloc must strengthen its industrial and technological infrastructure, increase defense investments, and adopt a coordinated strategy to reduce dependence on external powers. The plan includes more public and private funding, a reform of the European Investment Bank's mechanisms, and prioritizing European industry in strategic acquisitions. Macron argues that, in an unstable global scenario, Europe needs to act as a power and ensure its interests are respected. He also called on European Union leaders to match France's investments in the defense sector. For Macron, it's essential that the bloc moves as a united front in critical areas. His statements were seen as a firm response to Donald Trump's trade threats, but also as a clear signal: France is preparing and wants Europe to do the same. Macron's stance was bolstered by strategic voices within France itself. Industry Minister Marc Fesneau stated that any trade negotiation with the United States needs to carry a dimension of strength, something that imposes a real cost on Washington. To be effective, he said, Europe's response must target sectors crucial to the American economy. Dialogue alone isn't enough. Pressure is necessary. François Villeroy de Galhau, governor of the Bank of France, was even more direct. He called Trump's tariffs draconian and warned that they not only amplify global uncertainty, but also pose a concrete risk to economic stability. At the core of the European Union, the alarm was spreading too. Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, stated that a trade war would have no winners, only mutual damage. Meanwhile, European Council President Antonio Costa echoed a view shared with NATO's new Secretary General, Mark Rutte. A stronger Europe in defense also means a more balanced transatlantic alliance. Rutte brought a strategic observation: the United States sells far more defense equipment to Europe than the other way around, and this is set to grow even further as European allies increase their military budgets. In his words, with this billion-dollar flow, Trump could act with even greater force in the trade arena. The paradox is laid bare. The more Europe spends on defense, the more bargaining power Washington accumulates. Emmanuel Macron's firm stance found resonance among key European leaders. Support for France grew, along with the perception that the European Union needs to go beyond rhetoric and act more assertively. The tariff crisis has ceased to be a bilateral issue and has become a point of political cohesion within the bloc. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz stated that the EU has enough capacity to respond to American tariffs, but made it clear the goal should be dialogue, not confrontation. In his words, trade wars are unnecessary and stupid, a political and economic cost no one should bear. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk reinforced that Europe and the United States still need each other, especially in a scenario of tensions with Russia and China's growing influence. For him, an economic war between allies would be a strategic mistake. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen shared the same logic. We avoid conflicts with partners, but if pushed, we'll respond with strength and unity. Still, the prevailing tone among leaders was one of restraint. Even amid the hardening rhetoric, many emphasized the need for dialogue with Washington, trying to prevent the tariff escalation from turning into a permanent deadlock. But the collective message was clear. If Trump crosses the line, Europe will respond. For many European leaders, protectionism isn't just a risky policy, it's a direct threat to citizens' well-being. Irish Taoiseach Michel Martin was emphatic. Both the European Union and the United States need to cooperate constructively. When tariffs become economic weapons, the ones who pay the price are the populations on both sides of the Atlantic. Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo reinforced this point, saying that amid global instability, the priority should be dialogue with Trump, especially since, for him, the greatest threat to Europe remains Russia. Luxembourg's Prime Minister Luc Frieden offered a more structural take. Beyond banking union, Europe needs a defense union. For him, while retaliation is the most logical path against American tariffs, the ideal would be to avoid this kind of confrontation, because, in the end, everyone loses. In Spain's view, expressed by Minister Carlos Cuerpo, the European Union will continue to be a defender of free trade. But Cuerpo issued a clear warning. The bloc won't be naive. It will protect its companies and ensure they can compete on equal footing with external partners. In the background, the dominant sentiment was unanimous. Support for Macron's firmness, yes, but with a decisive appeal for diplomacy. The European consensus, at least for now, is that this crisis needs to be resolved at the negotiating table before the economic escalation becomes irreversible. The current tariff crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It's just another chapter in a historically unstable relationship between the United States and France, marked by diplomatic highs and strategic setbacks. And now, with Macron raising the tone and Trump threatening new tariffs, the question is straightforward. How far can this tension go? The signs of strain aren't new. Early in his second term, Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization, two milestones that directly affected Europe's perception of America's commitment to global governance. For France, this felt like a calculated distancing. In contrast to that moment of rupture, it's worth recalling that in 2007, relations between the two countries were at a high. Nicolas Sarkozy, newly elected president of France, was dubbed Sarkozy the American, and he took pride in the title. But that brief moment of alignment was quickly replaced by a downward trajectory. Over the years, trust between Washington and Paris eroded, fueled by disagreements over climate, international security, and trade. Now, with the real possibility of more tariffs, the standoff threatens to turn this history of tension into an open confrontation. And what's at stake goes far beyond trade balances. The friction between Trump and Macron is nothing new. It's merely a reflection of a relationship that, since 2017, has swung between diplomatic cordiality and public clashes. In July of that year, Trump was welcomed by Macron in Paris, in a gesture that seemed to signal a rapprochement. But that truce was short-lived. The following year, Macron addressed the U.S. Congress and openly defended the U.S. rejoining the Paris Agreement. The response was immediate and hostile. Congressman Thomas Massie attacked Macron with ideological labels, calling him a globalist socialist militarist. A few months later, Trump would mock the French leader, taunting his proposals, his approval ratings, and even France's record in World War II. These public exchanges of barbs continued. When Trump decided to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, Macron sharply criticized the move. The French ambassador in Washington was even more pointed. He said the U.S. under Trump was isolated. And in 2019, Macron went so far as to question whether the United States was still truly committed to Europe. Now, with new tariffs on the table, this historical tension gains another layer. The relationship was already unstable, but the impact of this trade policy could tangibly harm both sides. The risk isn't just diplomatic, it's economic. political, and geostrategic. To understand the real impact of Trump's tariffs, we need to look at the data. Before the current tension, France and the United States maintained a solid economic relationship, marked by interdependence and mutual gains. Trade between the two countries saw a notable recovery after the pandemic, reaching record levels in 2022. But in 2023, that momentum slowed. The total trade volume dropped to 97 billion euros, a decline of 12.4 billion from the previous year. The fall was driven by specific factors, like lower energy prices and a sharp drop in French exports of beverages and cruise ships. Still, even in slowdown, the figures remained above pre-COVID levels. The trade in services followed a slightly positive trajectory, growing 2% to reach 70.4 billion euros. French imports of services rose to 27.3 billion, while exports hit 43.2 billion, a stable performance, though with a slight loss of position in the global ranking. The United States' importance to France remains strategic. In 2023, Americans were the fourth largest destination for French products and the fifth largest supplier to the country. The message behind these numbers is clear. Any tariff rupture between Paris and Washington affects a robust trade flow at a time when both sides are already facing internal economic pressures. After 4 consecutive years of surpluses, the trade balance between France and the United States began to shift direction. In 2022, the balance turned negative, posting a deficit of 13.3 billion euros. In 2023, that figure dropped to 6.6 billion, still negative, but with a slight recovery. Strategic sectors like aeronautics, pharmaceuticals, and beverages continued to drive French exports. However, all saw a decline compared to the previous year. The steepest drop came from the beverage sector, which lost 1 billion euros, a fall of over 20%, marking the largest decline ever recorded in that category. Other segments also retreated, including cruise ships, vessels, and even pharmaceuticals. The only relief came from wind turbine exports, which helped prevent a sharper drop. Even with this slowdown, the economic relationship between the two countries had remained functional, without open ruptures. But with Trump's new protectionist guidelines, that balance is at risk. The current scenario pressures Paris to rethink its trade priorities, and an inevitable question begins to emerge. If the United States becomes an unstable partner, which other power could fill that space? Amid the strain with Washington, France is starting to intensify another diplomatic avenue: Beijing. Relations between France and China have evolved rapidly in recent years, and Emmanuel Macron's visit to Beijing in April 2023 marked a turning point. During the meeting, both sides signed a series of agreements symbolizing an expanding strategic bond. Among the commitments made, France and China advocated diplomatic solutions to the Ukrainian crisis and urged the international community to act in a coordinated manner on multiple global fronts. China, represented by Xi Jinping, signaled strong interest in strengthening economic ties, signing 18 agreements with French companies and expanding cooperation channels. That momentum didn't stop there. In May 2024, Xi and Macron met again, this time in the Hautes-Pyrénées, France. The agenda was broad and geostrategic: trade, security, culture, climate, and the architecture of global power. Macron emphasized the importance of Europe maintaining its strategic independence, even as it deepens ties with China. Xi, in turn, reinforced the idea of global stability through dialogue and mutual respect. The message was clear. While the United States hardens its stance, China presents itself as a willing, pragmatic partner, and now closer to Paris than ever. The ties between France and China aren't a recent convenience. They have deep roots, shaped by centuries of exchanges, ruptures, and rebuilding. Since the 17th century, the two countries established commercial and cultural connections, though their relationship has oscillated between periods of intense cooperation and phases of strategic distancing. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, France maintained a significant commercial presence in China. But after recognizing Taiwan in the Cold War context, diplomatic ties deteriorated rapidly, leading to a suspension of formal relations. It was only in 1964 that diplomatic channels were restored, marking the start of a new, more pragmatic phase, though still limited by ideological differences. Over time, those barriers softened. The creation of the Franco-Chinese Strategic Alliance in 2004 represented a turning point. Trade, culture, education, and science became permanent axes of cooperation. In 2015, this alignment strengthened with the signing of the Joint Declaration on Climate Change, paving the way for the Paris Agreement, a moment when France and China acted side by side in one of the century's biggest multilateral pacts. Today, these historical ties are regaining prominence in a scenario where France seeks strategic alternatives to an increasingly fragmented West. Since taking office in 2017, Emmanuel Macron has prioritized deepening relations between France and China, not just in trade, but also in cultural and strategic matters. For him, the future of French global influence is directly tied to building a solid axis with Beijing. On his first official visit to China in January 2018, Macron signed significant agreements in nuclear energy, agriculture, and tourism, while pressing for corrections to trade imbalances and greater access to the Chinese market. He also advocated for a broader rapprochement between China and the European Union, making it clear that Sino-French ties could reshape the continent's economic balance. Even amid the conjunctural challenges of recent years and structural political differences, the two countries continued expanding their cooperation. In 2019, China became the largest source of foreign direct investment in France. From there, agreements diversified. Green finance, intellectual property, and civil aviation began to occupy a central space on the bilateral agenda. The numbers solidify this trend. Trade between France and China reached $78.9 billion in 2023, an extraordinary leap compared to previous decades. China became France's most significant trading partner outside the European Union, and within the bloc, Paris assumed a strategic position as a bridge for dialogue with Beijing. In 2023, France's sectoral deficit with China more than doubled, jumping from 1.1 billion to 2.92 billion euros. The figure reveals a growing dependence of the French market on Chinese goods, with the trade balance tilting heavily in Beijing's favor. France is importing far more than it exports, and this has significant geoeconomic implications. Among the main Chinese products entering the French market are electronic equipment, industrial machinery, energy components, boilers, furniture, prefabricated structures, and vehicles, a range that reflects China's strategic penetration into essential sectors of the European economy. On the other hand, UN Comtrade data suggest that Chinese imports of French products may also be adjusting, indicating a possible commercial realignment underway. The overall picture is clear. With Donald Trump's aggressive tariff stance toward the European Union, China increasingly emerges as an alternative trade partner for France. Emmanuel Macron's incisive comments reinforce this direction, and that hasn't gone unnoticed in Brussels or Washington. Experts are already warning, if the tariff crisis follows the path of escalation rather than dialogue, the risk won't just be commercial, it'll be geopolitical, and a gradual shift by France toward China could represent a profound change in the balance of economic power among the major Western powers. The tariff crisis between the United States and the European Union remains unresolved, but one thing is already certain. In times of global realignment, every political move carries strategic weight. France is redesigning its options, and the world is watching closely. If you value in-depth analyses like this, subscribe to the Strategic Flow channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episodes, and leave a like. It helps us keep bringing you content with precision, context, and a global perspective. Thanks for following along, and see you in the next analysis.